Robin, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs today. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here.
I was very interested to discover your book and your work. I think friends are one of the most important things in the world, and I'm so glad to find a whole book justifying that belief.
Yeah, well, friends are the beginning of the end of the secret of life, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because I think that there's lots of reasons, lots of very obvious reasons that we might see friends as being beneficial. Um, but one of the things that we don't necessarily think about immediately is about how friends can impact our health. So I thought that was a compelling aspect of the research that you compiled in your book. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. How can friends be beneficial? I think one of the things that you found was that having friends even can make you less likely to fall prey to disease, for example.
Yeah, this is a culmination, really, of a huge amount of epidemiological work that's been done over the last 15 years, maybe, which I think has caught everybody left field. And that really has been to show that the best predictor of your mental health and well-being, your physical health and well-being, and even how long you live into the future from today is simply the number and quality of close friendships you have. And the kind of typical optimal number is about 5, be a bit smaller for introverts, probably a fraction higher for extroverts, but typically about 5 is where we need to be. But that comes off the back of a lot of work, including a lot of ours, which has shown that people are just happier and more contented. They trust the community they live amongst. They have more friends in their neighborhood. If they, have this sort of core group of close friends with whom they're well embedded. And the key to it is not just to be able to sort of do what kids in kindergarten do, which is say, Jimmy's my friend, when actually Jimmy doesn't want to be your friend at all. This has to be a two-way thing. Friendship, of course, it's a two-way thing. So it's having meaningful friendships of that kind really seems to lift your psychological state. Well, I sometimes describe it as the best antidepressant medicine you can get, and it's free. Just costs you a bit of time. You don't even have to spend money on it. But the effects are absolutely extraordinary, and they're just popping up all over the place in terms of serious physical illnesses. Your likelihood of catching kind of virus-driven diseases and some cancers that are influenced by the number of friendships you have, and that is probably there's a sort of hint in the biochemistry literature that the mechanism involved is that the things you do with friends. Well, I suppose you might say there's two parts to friendship here that work in this context. One is that they turn up with a bowl of chicken soup when you're stuck in bed with some dreaded disease. In other words, they come and do favors for you and help you out in a kind of more physical sense. But also, it's the kinds of things we do to build friendships, laughing together, telling stories together, singing, dancing occasionally on the tabletops, those kind of things, eating together, trigger the endorphin system in the brain. The endorphin system in the brain is part of the brain's pain management system. It's an opiate, but we don't get addicted to it. It's chemically slightly different enough to the dreaded opiates, which these days are causing such a problem everywhere, that it doesn't have quite the same addictive properties. And that's, of course, because they've evolved to manage this system and be part of our biology. But they turn out, when they're released in the brain, to trigger the immune system. I sometimes describe it as tuning up the immune system, in the sense that they trigger the release of natural killer cells in particular in the white blood cell system. And natural killer cells particularly target viruses, which is kind of ideal just at the moment, and also some cancers in particular. And so there's a kind of clear biological mechanism there that indirectly, if you like, allows friendships to affect our physical health and well-being, and not just our psychological health and well-being. I mean, the psychological health and well-being is much easier to see because that's the kind of natural way that endorphins act. They are give you a lift, and they make you feel relaxed and calm and at peace with the world, and the world's a wonderful place, and whoever you're doing this activity with, laughing, singing, dancing, having a chat, is a wonderful person, and all's well with the world. And that's like psychological uplift that it gives you.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm curious to know how numbers factor in, like, is it having a lot of friends? Is it the kinds of friendships that we're having? Is there like a magic number of friends that you should have?
Well, you might well suppose that if friends are so beneficial for you, the more friends you have, the better. Have an infinite number of friends and you'll live forever. Unfortunately, it's not possible. For two key reasons. There are very strict limits imposed on the number of friends we can have. One is simply that friendships, or any kind of relationship of that kind, family relationships or friendships, are extremely expensive to process. It involves a lot of thinking about what the person is doing and why, and why did they say that yesterday, and did they mean it, or are they just pulling my leg? All these kinds of things. That's extremely hard work for the brain to do. Therefore, there's only so much space in the brain, in effect, for friendships, and that limit really appears to be at about 150, the number that's known as Dunbar's number. So on average, you can't have more than 150 friends and family. I might point out, extended family are all in there. And then typically, in the kind of modern world with our small families, that 150 would consist of about 75 members of your extended family, so way out to second cousins and a bit beyond maybe, and the other 75 would be true friends. So it's kind of split 50-50, although I hasten to add, as I've been told many times by people, if you come from a big family, you don't have many friends, because it takes you all your time getting around your cousins. And if you've got 40 first cousins, which is not unknown in the contemporary world.
Yeah.
My wife, for example, has 40 first cousins.
Wow.
I
think I have two.
well, I have one.
So we must have a lot more friends than she does.
Yes, exactly. But you give priority to family by and large, and by the time you've been around checking up on all your 40 first cousins, you don't have a lot of time left. Now, the other side of the coin, so there's a kind of brain limit, if you like, what the brain can handle. The other side of the coin goes to the fact that building and maintaining friendships is actually very expensive in terms of time, and you have to keep investing. Once you build a friendship up, you've got to keep investing in it, otherwise it will fade quietly away if you don't see the person. So time-wise, they're very expensive, and we kind of distribute our time in a very characteristic way, such that if you look at the structure of your social network, your extended social network of 150 friends and family, in terms of how much time you devote to each of them, how often do you ring them up, how often do you post to them on social media, how often do you see them in the flesh, you end up with a series of circles. It's a little bit like the ripples on a pond where you throw a stone in. So if you imagine yourself as the stone, sort of going out from you is a series of ripples. The ripples get bigger and bigger, but the kind of height of the wave gets smaller and smaller. And that really kind of is a good analogy for your social network. The inner layers tend to be very small, consist of a very small number of people, but the emotional closeness is very high. And then as you go out further and further, so you add more and more people in, but as a result, the emotional closeness declines because you're devoting less time to each of them. Now, just to put a scale on this of how expensive it is, you devote typically about 40% of your total social time to the 5 people in the center of your social world, the innermost circle. And you devote another 20% of your time to the next 10 people out. So those 2 layers that make up 15 people consume 60% of your total social effort, and we've measured it in terms of your emotional closeness to them, so your emotional capital, if you like, and you get exactly the same figure. 60% of your emotional capital is devoted to just 15 people. And I'm sorry to say that the poor folks out in the outer reaches of the solar system here, around the edges of your 150, get about 25 seconds a day on average from you. So you got to accumulate quite a few days to have enough time to spare to sit down, have a coffee with them, never mind spend the evening with them.
And so when we're talking about the benefits of friends in our lives in terms of health, mental health, all of those things, we're not just talking about numbers then. So I'm curious to know how we're gauging this. You know, what constitutes a close friend and just a versus like a casual acquaintance.
Yeah, we've measured this in various ways. Originally, when we started doing this work, we actually just asked people who would you see every week on average, typically, who would you see every month, typically, who would you see once a year, typically. And these produced a bunch of numbers, which turned out to be these layers, very neatly packaged. We've since looked at them in terms of Facebook postings. So these are on various freely available publicly available Facebook data sets, which were released way back, I guess, before Facebook realized how much money there was in these data. But it is known as the New Orleans Facebook data set for some reason that I don't understand. We've done it on telephone data sets. So this is cell phone data sets. In the particular data set we used, it's 20%. The subscribers are 20% of an entire European country. So it's something like 6 million subscribers and 6 billion phone calls over the course of a year. A Chinese study has done a very similar study using a Chinese cell phone provider's data set. And we get exactly the same picture, no matter whether we ask people, well, you know, how emotionally close do you feel to all these people? Make a list of, you know, the emotional closeness. We usually give them a very simple 1 to 10 scale, where kind of 10 is I love them dearly, and 1 is, well, you know, they're fine. I'm kind of on the edge of being neutral. It's not a negative scale. There's no negative component to it. It's people you feel positive about. And if you get them to rate all the people they know, or they have in their address book, or they have in their phone list, as it were, and rate them all, you know, these are the numbers that come out very nicely, and they turn out to correspond exactly to the numbers you get if you look at the actual phone calls that they make, or the actual postings they make. So we require those things like postings and telephone calls to be reciprocated. So, you know, we can strip out all the kind of free call numbers from phone data, as it were. That's easy enough to do. But of course, you still get a few cases where somebody's ringing their doctor or ringing their solicitor or their attorney or their baker to order some bread. And of course, not many of these phone back usually. So if you have a kind of rule which says there must be a return call from the number, it narrows it down quite nicely. And again, with things like Facebook posts, we've done it on Twitter as well, actually. And the Twitterati, the followers of a Twitter account talking to each other, posting in named tweets to each other in a conversation within a Twitter account, operating the same rule. Do you know who this person is, in the sense that you name them and they reply to you, and that's kind of repeated. So it's a kind of meaningful relationship. It may not, I hope in the case of Twitter, these relationships don't last too long. Otherwise it's a bit worrying that there are people who are spending their entire lives online and not meeting people in the flesh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the major changes, I think, in our world today, is that we spend so much time online and so much less time interacting with actual real physical people in real life. Do you get the sense that people have started to confuse what it means to have a friend because they have all these online friends? They feel like they know all of these people, but they're not necessarily people that they're interacting with in the material physically?
Well, actually, there's two comments that one can make about this. One is all our data on digital media, whether that's in the form of the telephone data sets or in the form of Facebook kind of data sets, or texting data sets, all suggest that they're very good substitutes for face-to-face interactions, or at least we use them in the same way. So not only do you see the same layers coming out in terms of differences between the frequencies with which you contact different people, but actually the rates at which you contact them are absolutely identical. So that inner core of 5 best friends are the people you tend to see at least once a week. Obviously, some of them you see probably close to every day, but the kind of fourth and fifth person, if you rank them in order of frequency of contact, will come in at about once a week. And you see exactly the same rate of phone calling, exactly the same rate of postings on social media. So they do seem to substitute, although I think probably everything our data and other people's data on this suggests is they function a bit more like a sticking plaster rather than nirvana. So if you don't see the person once in a while in the flesh, it kind of doesn't prevent that relationship quietly decaying and ending up as a kind of just an acquaintance and not a true friend. That takes a while for that to happen, of course. So it's not a perfect medium, I don't think. On the other hand, then the second comment really goes back to the fact that I should think every time I've given a talk on this stuff and said, no, you've only got 150 friends in the world, there's somebody in the audience says, but I have 1,500 on Facebook. To which I just sigh and say, yeah, and you also have 1,500 people in that same category in the real world. Just because they call them all friends on Facebook doesn't mean they're friends. And in fact, in other words, what people are doing, the average number of friends on Facebook, and I cite here the single largest study ever done, which was published about 10 years ago, which was on 61 million Facebook users pages, right? So that's a fairly sizable chunk, even if Facebook's whatever it is billion, or is it 2 billion now, subscribers. So probably you've got a fair chance that if you were on Facebook 10 years ago, you've got a fair chance you were in there in that sample, for which we thank you very much for contributing to science. But what the study showed was that this huge number of people on Facebook, they looked at the number of friends that everybody had listed on their page, and the average was 149. Now, on the strength of that being so close to 150, I'm inclined to suggest that I'm going to buy both of Abramovich's yachts off the prize money I'm going to collect on that, and I'm going to sit in the on my yacht in the Caribbean, and we can do this interview on the sun deck with a pina colada. so the answer is, if you look at the distribution of friends on Facebook, it looks very much like what you see in real life. On average, it's about 150. Some people have less, for very good reasons. Introverts tend to have less than 150. They tend to be sort of a bit down towards 100. Extroverts tend to have more. They tend to be up towards 250. But of course, beyond that, people are adding in these sort of layers that we have in real life that go out beyond 150. So the next layer out is actually at about 500. We'd refer to that as acquaintances. So these are people you know. You probably work with a lot of them. You go and have a beer with them after work. You might go on a kind of trip somewhere for the day to the seaside or whatever that been organized. But you wouldn't invite them home to your family party, right? Or a family wedding or something like that. But you know them well. And beyond that, there's a layer runs out to about 1,500. That seems to be the limit on the number of people whose faces we can put names to, So, for all of us, all over the world, there are a few odd people that everybody has in that lab. Donald Trump, for example, for better or for worse, you would recognize him if you saw him in the street. And that's the definition of that layer. And then beyond that, there's a final layer. It goes out to about 5,000, which are people who, when you see a photograph of them, you know whether you've seen them before or not. Don't know who they are necessarily. And couldn't put a name to a lot of them, but you have seen them at some point. And that layer seems to define really the limit on the number of people that you can recognize. And beyond that, they're complete strangers. And by design or accident, that was the limit that Facebook put on the number of friends you can have. I don't know why they chose that number. I'm sure it wasn't guided by anything, because the people who showed this limit at 5,000 only did the work about 3 years ago, just before lockdown, actually.
Okay.
So it's very, very recent. But I mean, I think Facebook just kind of plucked a number out of thin air that looked pretty large, and not many people would have that number. And in fact, not many people do. I mean, there are a few, but most of them are kind of journalists using Facebook as a kind of information source, or boy bands using them as a kind of cheap fan club. Hershey bars, I have probably got a product page. I don't know if they do. I know Cadbury's bars did have pages for them, and they're owned by Hershey, I think. So I think we won't count that as Hershey bars. Not many people have that number of friends, because you simply could not know who all of them are. The number that you would have meaningful relationships with is 150, and then you might push it out to 500 or maybe 1,000 in terms of, sort of just because you keep getting "please befriend this person" messages on the system and you like pressing buttons. But very, very few people in this huge sample, and there are others. Somebody else did a sample of 1 million Facebook pages, and had produced something very similar to what I'm describing. Very, very few people have more than ordinary everyday people, let's say, as opposed to professional users, have more than about 1,500 people listed. It's almost unheard of, simply because you wouldn't even recognize who they are. You wouldn't know their names, and never mind anything else.
Yeah, it's too much to keep track of.
yeah. Hard enough trying to keep track of the 50 people, important people right in the center.
Right, exactly. And I've read, and I'm sure most of us have read, lots of research that says that married people are healthier. They lead a healthier life if they're married. Men in particular, I've seen that
Mhm.
research. But I get the impression from your book that it's not actually necessarily marriage, that it's about relationships, friends, community. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say so. Sort of romantic relationships, whether they're marriages or live-in partners or whatever, are clearly important, and an important feature of almost everybody's life. But on the other hand, you need to have that couple, that pair needs to be embedded in a much wider network of supportive relationships, both family relationships and friendships, in order to function well, and probably as much as anything to have somewhere to go, shoulder to cry on
Right.
when it's
When the
really
marriage
going
isn't
badly.
going well.
Otherwise, yeah, 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 get you through the rough patches back to the sunny uplands, the other side. So that and the many things that friends do for us, in the sense of just providing a context for entertainment. You end up getting very bored if you're on a desert island with just two people, or even five people. Probably you would probably end up killing them, frankly, by the time
Probably.
you'd
You'd probably
finish.
be crazy by those people
That's
and
right.
feel less
Yeah,
healthy than
just
before.
driven mad. So it's important to have a widening circle beyond these kind of intimate layers, that can provide you, keep you sane and provide you with all sorts of other benefits. And those other benefits are things like help with childcare, help with running kids to school or to the baseball, or I suppose when they get teenagers, to dances, or whatever they teenagers do with their lives, and also kind of providing a kind of network of information and help with moving house, help with, and you've got a tree to cut down in your yard that's just getting too dangerous and you need someone come and help you do it. They're all those kind of things that just make everyday life smoother and more and richer for us. So it's really important to have them. The interesting thing in this context, though, is this very big gender difference between in the way friendships work and way relationships in general work, particularly friendships,
Mhm.
because the problem is that men are very socially very lazy. So what tends to happen in marriages is the women dominate the social arrangements because they're much, in that sense, much more social. So they go out and make friends, invite friends round, and make arrangements for social things. And the boys just tag along. And so what the women are doing is they're kind of making arrangements with their girlfriends, and all the husbands and boyfriends and what have you tag along, and they kind of mill about on the edge, staring into their cup of coffee or their beer or whatever's on offer at the event, and eventually they'll strike up a conversation amongst themselves, and they may form relationships and friendships, as it were. And this is very characteristic of boys' friendships generally, is they're very club-like. So here's the making of, ironically, one of the classic boys' friendship clubs, and that is the club of the husbands of my wife's girlfriends.
Right.
Right, it's perfectly functional basis for being a friend, because male friendships tend to be much less about who you are as an individual than what you are. Do you belong to a club of some kind? That may actually be a club, the club of guys who I don't know, go out and throw a baseball around on a Friday evening for something to do, or go and climb a mountain, or go canoeing. It's usually some activity involved. Whereas women's friendships are much more a matter of who you are than what you are. So they're very
Mm.
kind of focused and dyadic, and in that sense much more kind of emotionally close. And herein lies the problem for the guys, really, is that if they get divorced or widowed, they lose overnight half their friendship circle,
Mm.
because all their partners, friends, and family, of course, in the first case, in the case of divorce, they think he's the baddie.
Mm.
They're going to side with their half of the family for sure, and
Mhm.
their friend, so they won't talk to him. So instantly he's lost half his network. And because we're kind of very shy about these things, at least in the kind of Western world anyway, and we feel embarrassed if somebody is widowed, sort of, if you unless you know them really well, you kind of feel very reluctant to go and sort of knock on their door and say, how are you doing? Come out and have a beer, or let's go for a walk, or something like that. We have this anxiety, terrible anxiety about doing this, so nothing happens. So even with the best will in the world, they're probably sitting at home saying, oh God, we ought to go around and see Jim and see how he's doing, but they just can't quite get off the sofa and go and do it. The guy ends up losing half his network. I think that then you have the cause of a lot of depression and even the high-ish suicide rate that you get in divorced and widowed men by comparison with women.
And I'm curious to know a little bit more about that, the differences in terms of how women do friendship versus how men do friendship. How is it that men are connecting with other men versus how women are connecting with other women? Or
Yeah,
just
this
how they're connecting in general, I suppose, to other
sure.
people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is actually a really interesting issue, because we hadn't expected it, and it completely came out of the blue when we were doing our research. And then we discovered various other people. Joyce Benenson at Harvard, for example, was finding very similar kinds of effects. The surprise was nobody really, well, we certainly hadn't really expected to find very striking, with these kinds of very striking differences. The differences really bear down in large part actually to the fact that, as I've already mentioned, women's friendships are much more focused and dyadic, whereas men's have this kind of casual
Mm.
feel to them. They really are a case of out of sight, out of mind. If Jimmy goes away, well, let's do it the other way around. If Susan, your friend Susan, goes away, a girl will kind of be on the phone, on Facebook, texting. I try and keep that relationship going and keep it
Mhm.
fresh. And for guys, it'll kind of be out of sight, out of mind, and
Mhm.
they'll just look around and say, "Oh, we're a guy short on the regular Friday evening. Who's next in the queue?"
Feels like someone's missing. Oh, well.
Yes, oh,
I can
Pete,
recall.
he'll do. And
Yeah.
they just shoehorn Pete in, and he slots exactly into where Jimmy had been in the group, and everything is dandy. This is kind of reflected also in terms of um, uh, other features of the close friendship circle. So you have this phenomenon, it's kind of well understood and well known now, as known as the best friend forever, a BFF. And that is extremely common in women. Something in our data anyway, and we have several large samples on this now. Something like 85% of women will have a best friend forever, and 85% of those best friends forever will be another woman.
Mm.
And that kind of remains very, very stable from sort of teenage years right the way through into later life. Dips a bit in old age, but throughout most of our active social life, this frequency doesn't really change that much. Boys don't really have these kind of very close, intimate, emotionally close relationships. If you ask them, do you have a best friend? They'll sort of come and a bit and say, oh yeah, I go out with Jimmy quite a lot, a bit more than the others. But it still has a certain casualness to it in a way that isn't true. You're much more likely. So we did a study of Facebook profile pictures some years ago, which highlighted this very nicely, because what we found in essentially is that if you, and this is on a very, very large sample of Facebook profile pictures, if you have just two people in the picture, it's very likely, and it's two people of the same age. So this is not you and your mum, or your mum with you as a baby, or you with your baby, what have you, but two similar age people. It's much more likely to be a girl's Facebook page, and there's a 50-50 split between whether it's a male or a female. The males are presumably, we're dealing with very large numbers here, mostly their current romantic partner or husband or whatever. And if it's a girl, they're very, very likely to be the best friend forever. You very rarely see two boys in a picture. What you're much more likely to see is four or even five, right?
Right,
And
like a
they'll be
fishing
doing
trip or
something.
something.
Yeah. So it'll be, and that's say if it's more than about three in the picture, it's never a girl's picture. It's always a boy's picture. And they will be doing something. So it'll be five guys sitting on the top of the hill at Machu Picchu, kind of peering down, looking down at the thing, or five guys in canoes on sort of the lake somewhere, or five guys sitting around a table, raising a glass of beer to the camera. Be some activity involved, rather than sort of here's my best friend. These are the guys I do stuff with, basically. So that sense of this casualness thing also comes out in what, or maybe it's more to do with how the relationships are built up and maintained. So we did this on a longitudinal study. What we did over time was ask, and we had a group of people who are helping us out with this, and providing their kind of regular phone bills, so itemized phone bills, so we could track their who they were phoning and texting, and they were filled in questionnaires saying who they actually saw in person and what they did with them. And it turned out very, very clearly that if you ask the question, what maintains a friendship over time, keeps it going, when the two people have been separated. These were college-age kids, so we picked them up at the end of high school, followed them through their first year at university, at college. That's a big change. You're meeting all sorts of new people, making new friends, right? There's a lot of turnover, but there are some friends you keep. What allowed those old friendships to carry on at the same level? For girls, it was making the big effort to talk to them in some way, either going and seeing them face to face or phoning them a lot. If you looked at the amount of the effect of conversation effort in boys' friendships, it had zero effect, and I mean zero effect, on whether an old friendship would last or just die away. But what made the difference for boys' friendships was doing stuff together, making the effort to go back and see their friends and do something together. So, if they're kind of, I don't know, like climbing mountains together, or, sort of doing massive open sea swimming events, these kind of crazy things that people do. It was making the effort to go and pick those up. Whereas those kind of things, even doing more casual things like going on holiday together, or helping people move house, or these kind of things, going shopping with them, or whatever. They had some effect on how well the girls' friendships lasted. But it was nothing like the effect that it had in the case of the boys, or that the effect of talking together had in the case of their own relationships. So boys bang heads together in some way. That's how they make friendships. And the one thing they don't do much is talk.
Right. And does that have, I mean, it's obviously a cliche that's true in many ways, but I mean, is that part of what's having an impact on the level of friendship and the level of connection, how they're engaging? Like women are more likely to kind of engage in a more emotional level, I
Yeah.
suppose, whereas men, as you say, are sort of just like casually doing things together. So
Yeah.
it often feels like men's relationships are a bit more superficial than women's relationships. Not in all cases, of course, but
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
right, right.
Um, uh, yeah, I mean, but I mean, the problem is, I mean, we always kind of dismiss things as oh, it's just a stereotype. But the problem is, that
Mhm.
stereotypes didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah.
They invariably come from observation
Something. Yeah,
over
yeah.
very long periods of human history and into what actually happens. Um,
Yeah.
so it is. Yeah, I guess if you're a boy, you kind of go, oh yeah, well, all relationships are a bit casual. And there are lots of kind of examples of that. I think the number of times I've been told by people, their wives usually, in after talks when I talk about this stuff is, oh, my husband, he was off on a business trip and he was going right past the front door of his old kind of high school friend whom he, hasn't seen for years, but was a great friend of his. And I said to him, why don't you go and drop in and get the response? Oh, maybe not. And I know jolly well he's not going to do it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Whereas if it was girls, they would do it.
Yeah,
They'd
yeah,
make the effort.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's strange. I don't quite get it. What is there something
yeah.
to that? Why is that?
well, I mean, the problem is, I mean, we tend to always take the view, oh, one must be better and the other not. Same with
Right.
extroverts and introverts. Extroverts have more friends, but they have shallower friendships because they're distributing their time, their available social time, more thinly
Mm,
for more people. Introverts have fewer friends, but they do that in order to focus and concentrate what time they have on their friendships to make sure they work well. And it's the same with the gender difference. It's just two different ways of solving the same problem, and obviously they overlap. All of these overlap in the middle somewhere, to some extent. They're just two ways of solving the same problem. But they're probably driven by different requirements. I still kind of don't understand why the gender difference should be there. There are kind of some suggestions that run along the line that in small scale kind of traditional societies, tribal societies, which obviously we spent most of our evolutionary history in
mhm,
until mere 8,000 years ago, and many people even more recently than that. The young men are the defense force and maybe even the police force, but as the defense force of the community, they have to be able to stick together and stick beside each other's backs, as it were, in the face of the enemy. You can't, you're not going to get very far if your army on the battlefield, even in the modern world, suddenly decides, I don't like this, I'm getting out of here. They've got
mhm,
to stick with each other's backs. And so you have to have this kind of bondedness, this group bondedness, and this sense of belonging to a group rather than just to a particular individual. And kind of, there's some plausibility to that. The converse argument with the girls, though, I think is interesting, because if you look at most traditional societies and most small scale societies, even after agriculture, what tends to happen is the women move on marriage, right? So
mm,
it's not a universal thing by any means, but disproportionately, it's probably larger number of cases in which the women move to the husband's village or the husband's camp than the other way around. Now, the problem for the girls in this context is they're going into a social environment in which everybody else in the community is related by marriage or in-lawship or anything else you care to think of to the husband, and they have nobody, because they've come from a different village. Now the girl's got two problems here. One is she needs some moral support in the context of any disagreements that might happen either within the marriage or with anybody else in the community. And B, the whole process of bearing and rearing children, particularly, we've not done away with this by any means at all in the modern world, but in small-scale societies, it's kind of a bit more focused and hard-nosed, if you like, is hugely costly, and that you can't do it on your own. So, having somebody else who has a very strong relationship with you and will stand by you and put themselves out to come and help you with these processes of reproduction, because they're not trivial. You do it wrong and you can end up dying very easily. You just need or we as a species just need help. So having a kind of close buddy who's really bonded to you in the same sense of bonded as a romantic relationship, but doesn't have that kind of romance connection, as it were. You can stand aside from that a little bit. May be hugely, or may have been hugely important. I suspect it still is, even in the modern world, because obviously the girl's mother is the best person to do this, or a sister maybe, because they've got a vested interest both in the girl and in the offspring that are produced. We all know this. Grandmothers will put down the knitting at the drop of a hat to go and help out with grandchildren, right? So it's in effect the same thing. But then if they're not there, it's really much harder work for you. And if this is the problem that in many small-scale traditional societies the girls have, I think, is that they're completely on their own. If they didn't have that support, and failing a family relationship of that kind on your side rather than the husband's side, the best person to have a friendship with is somebody who has the same problems to deal with, because that's a common bond. And that's one of the kind of binding forces of friendships is somebody who faces the same kinds of generic problems and ways of doing things, as it were, as you do. That's a very, this effect is extremely strong. But we still kind of see that, I think. I mean, if there's somebody's recently published some data on this, actually, which was interesting, but I've always had this sense that women who, particularly their first offspring, is produced away from their home family environment. In other words, away from sisters and grandmothers who could come and help or be consulted over is the baby doing all right, and is this normal, and all these kinds of things that we worry about the newborn babies, have a much harder time than women who have that first baby in particular. But I don't think it gets necessarily any better with later babies, in the home patch, where they can literally walk round to the block and knock on, sort of mum's door or sister's door and say, I don't know, I need some help.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. Like, there's as much as we're sort of almost overstimulated on our culture, and it feels like we're around a lot of people. It feels like maybe we're engaging a lot of people again because of social media and things like that. There does also seem to be a big problem with isolation and loneliness.
Yes. Well, I think this came through very clearly actually during lockdown, because all the studies that were done over lockdown, everybody kind of found it very tiresome and irritating, not to be able to go out and do the kinds of things you're doing. But all the studies have suggested very strongly that women found it much harder than the men.
Mm.
The men kind of went, oh God, means I'll have to spend another 2 hours online on my gaming program. Oh well, that's not so bad.
Oh, well.
whereas the women were kind of getting much more frustrated and I guess depressed maybe, and so on, because they couldn't go and see their friends in the way that, or their family in the way that they did. And quite clearly, despite the magic of Zoom and Skype and all these other digital media, it just didn't quite work in the same way. I mean, it's really interesting seeing how it was used and what people's experiences of it was. It seems to have worked okay for family, because one of the problems you have with anything like this online is you cannot have more than 4 people in a conversation, period. That is how life works. Just like, if you don't believe me, just go and watch the next reception you're at. You'll see it before your eyes. You cannot have more than 4 people in a conversation. If a 5th person joins, it'll be 2 separate conversations within 30 seconds, if even that long. Now, the problem with digital media like Zoom and Skype and so on, you can have 500 people on there, but the thing very quickly gets dominated by the 4 people with the loudest voices, and everybody else retreats into the background, and spends their time paying half an ear to the conversation and checking their news feeds and their email and watching the cats fighting in the backyard and all these other things that are there to distract you. So for family relationships are much more tolerant of 4 people dominating the conversation, because that's probably what happens anyway at Thanksgiving dinners. But it doesn't work if it's not family. It didn't seem to work terribly well after a while with groups of friends. So a lot of people kind of had regular kind of once a week or maybe more often Zoom sessions with their group of friends, their girlfriends or whatever, and it kind of paled into a form of tedium after a month or two, and people just didn't get the buzz out of it, I think, that they expected. Family things work okay, not friendships. Meetings with strangers or business meetings with the folks you work with just didn't have the kind of excitement that you might have expected. They don't have the excitement of the kind of face-to-face. If you had that meeting is face-to-face, it would be a completely different experience. And it's because the dynamics of a face-to-face environment are very different and allow you to do more things, form sub-conversations and things like that in a way you can't online.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did learn over the pandemic was that you can't actually replace a real, sitting around having drinks with your friends with a Zoom cocktail hour. It's just not the same.
Yes,
I actually found it depressing, and I think I tried a couple times and then decided that was making me feel worse than not doing it at all.
Not to be too cynical, your dress doesn't get wet when somebody else spills their drink.
No.
There's something missing.
Totally different experience.
and I think that probably goes back to what the issue is here. And that is, in the context of everyday meetings that we have with our friends, casual meetings, whether it's for a coffee or just taking a walk in the park or having dinner with them or a beer in a bar or whatever it may be that you do, we engage in a huge amount of physical contact with them. We're forever patting them on the back and stroking their arms and giving them a hug and all these kind of things. We don't do it with everybody. And it's very clear. I mean, we've actually done studies of this all over Europe and in Japan, and the picture you get is very, very similar. how much of the body is permissible to touch, and you feel comfortable about touching somebody or them touching you, depends very much on the closeness of the relationship. But once you get beyond about 50 people in your network, we think it's probably about there, and that would probably count out to about your cousins, your good friends and your cousins, and anybody else closer than that. Beyond that number, you don't really engage in this physical kind of contact touching, soft touch as it's sometimes called, with people. And by the time you get out to strangers, it's at arm's length. And all over this huge sample across up and down and left to right of Europe and in Japan, everybody was absolutely consistent. If it's a stranger, the only place they're allowed to touch you is your hand. Right? So, which is basically saying, I'm sort of extending a little bit of me in your direction, but you ain't coming any closer.
Only this part.
Yeah.
And from
not
this
until I
away.
know you better. So,
yeah.
But aside from that side, for these kind of more central, meaningful relationships that we have, friendships and family relationships, these kind of little casual touches are going on all the time, and they really are harking back to the way primates use social bonding, social grooming, leafing through the fur and removing bits of vegetation, rubbish and stuff, is used to bond relationships. It's a very physical based thing. And of course, we don't have, a body full of fur anymore. We just have a little bit left on the top of the head, as it were. And so because we don't have the fur covering to do all this classic primate type social grooming, leafing through the fur, we've substituted that with, things like caresses and strokes and hugs and the like, because they do the same job, and the same job here is triggering the endorphin system. So we have this highly specialized neural system in the skin, which responds to one thing and one thing only, and that is light, slow stroking at a rate of just under 2 inches a second. And that is the speed of movement of the hands across the fur as they're sort of parting the fur when they're grooming each other, that you see in primate social grooming. And it's sort of about the speed of, a stroke on the arm or a pat on the back, as it were. And it's triggering the endorphin system and providing this very, very old, ancient, if you like, primitive mechanism that triggers the endorphin system and makes you feel bonded, and obviously conveying other kinds of signals as well that I sometimes describe this as, if you really want to know how somebody feels about you, ignore what they say, because it's probably lies anyway. Check out how they touch you, because you cannot lie when you touch somebody else. It's a completely honest declaration of how you feel about them.
Yeah.
And that's what you should. And it goes back to this very, very ancient primate way of creating and building social bonds.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah.
We've added lots of other mechanisms. Excuse me. Lots of other mechanisms on top of grooming. So things like laughter and singing and dancing and feasting and telling stories and these kind of things, which also trigger the endorphin system, as it turns out. But these supplement physical contact, essentially.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about loneliness and how people can combat it, which is to say, in part, how do we make friends? For people who are struggling, you often hear this thing, and I don't know, this has not been true in my case, so I don't actually buy it, but you often hear this thing where it's like, you can't make friends after 30, and it's so hard to make friends, and we all sort of, especially I think in North America, in places like Canada, the US, in Britain also, I think people tend to start self-isolating more as they get older. Maybe they get married and they have a family, so they sort of contain themselves to that bubble more. But then at the same time, people get lonely. So how do you make a true friend? How do you bond? Like, how are we bonding with one another? How do we form and maintain friendships that can combat this loneliness that is so not just sad, but as you found in all of your work and your research, it's bad for your health.
Yeah, and it's a big problem. I mean, we have been saddled with a pandemic of loneliness, particularly among the 20-somethings, moving away to their first job to a strange city where they don't know anybody outside the work environment. So there's been a huge problem. It's been going on for several decades now. But yes, I'm sort of tempted to say, Meghan, why are you asking me? I'm a boy. I don't understand friendships.
I mean, I seem to be doing okay in the friendship realm, so maybe I can answer it. And yeah, clearly you have no idea.
Yes, yes.
But you've done the research, so maybe other people have given you some hints.
The problem, I think, is, and I think this goes back, I mean, you're quite right that there's a kind of period in life where you, in effect, start to lose friendships for one reason or another and don't replace them. In your teens and your 20s, I would say, this is a hyper-social world. The whole point of existence is to engage socially, because you're kind of looking for the lifelong friendship circles that you want to make. So I always describe that age cohort as careful shoppers. They're checking out all the supermarkets to see where the best deals are. So they tend to have something pushing. By the time they get into their 20s, they often, if you ask them to list out their friendship networks, friendship and family networks, they'll often produce a figure closer to about 250 rather than 150. But by the 30s, that comes down to the official figure of 150 very quickly. You shed lots of those. I think most of that is the costs of children, just the sheer time costs involved and the exhaustion having small children to look after. So you narrow down on the ones that are really meaningful. So in effect, you've kind of checked out all the supermarkets. You've decided which one supermarket is the best one to put all your money into. And then that remains fairly stable until you get through to probably about 65-ish, and then it starts to decline very steadily and quite fast. So you'll and that's partly because our friends, indeed our family, the family that we feel close to, tend to be the same age as us. So they're starting to die off. They're also starting to move away because they retire and they go to sunny Florida, or they want to go and live near the grandkids. The kids have moved off to a different part of the country, or maybe even the next country, have gone to Canada or something. So you want to go and be near them to enjoy your grandkids. So a lot of your friends start to vanish, and you just don't have the energy or the motivation to kind of fill the empty slots. Whereas, in your teens and 20s, if a friend disappears off to Australia or Thailand or somewhere and decides to stay there, you just go out to all the places that you usually go to socializing and find a few more people. So those effects, seem to be very robust. They've been documented all over in data sets from Europe and North America and so on. Very widespread experience. The problem is, if once you get, I think in your 20s, your teens and 20s, you have a kind of ready-made social life for you, in the sense that family and school, your kind of home community, your school, college, they kind of create a pool of potential friends that you can go meet up with and make friends with, or not, as you prefer. It's what happens after that. Where do you go to meet friends? I think this is the problem with older people. you haven't been clubbing since you were in your mid-20s, you're not sure if you would be welcome in a club, because you're not sure who actually goes.
Right.
Even if the doorman would let you in. And you're not sure, what do people talk about these days in those kind of places? What you talked about with your friends sitting in your little corner of the bar you always go to, or the park bench you always sit on, or your backyard when you have friends around. What interests you, but is that the case for anybody else? And then on top of that, you've got the other problem. The Jane Austen problem, as I always describe it, is namely, just because you would like to be friends with somebody doesn't mean that somebody else is going to be your friend, right? Because they've already got friends. And this is the problem for the 20-somethings going to their first job in the big city, the other side of the country, is they're going into they don't know where to go to meet friends that's kind of safe and congenial and has like-minded people there, because they don't know, the city at all. The only people they know are the people at work. Well, most of the people at work have got families, they've got friendship circles, they're busy. They haven't the time to pick you up and
to bring someone new on.
Yeah, exactly. Because if they do, it means they've got to sacrifice an old friend, right? They've got to drop somebody.
Yeah.
So this is the core of the problem, and I'm always reminded of the girls in Jane Austen's novels. I mean, she was such an acute observer of human life and human foibles, as it were. And here are all the Bennets and sisters and so on, sort of desperately hoping that Mr. Darcy will turn up. Well, the problem is, there's 10 of you girls in the village, and there's one Mr. Darcy. And only one of you is going to get them. So what are the rest going to do? Well, what they did and what we do to this day, since she was just Jane Austen was just observing what people actually did, is eventually you hang on and hang on and hang on in there, hoping that Mr. Darcy's double is going to turn up. And when eventually he doesn't, you decide that anything is better than nothing, and you marry the curate. Who's definitely second best. But what's the choice? It's marrying the curate, or not marrying at all, effectively not having a friend. So you settle for what you can get, and therein lies part of the problem. We're very picky and choosy, for very good reasons, of course, in who we'd like to have friends with, and we're always hankering after the perfect friend. But at the same time, we kind of make dues, what I call school gate friends. This probably doesn't happen in the US, but it happens here. So you walk your kids to school, or you drive them to school yourself. In many cases, particularly in kind of primary schools, but even in junior high schools. And you're hanging around the school gates at the end of school day, waiting to collect your kids coming out, and you start talking to the other parents, maybe, and kids come out and they say, can I go and play with Jemima at her house, and stay for tea? And then, it becomes, can I stay the night, and going to her party, and so on. And eventually the parents start to gravitate together, pulled together by the children. Mm-hmm. And this, sometimes these friendships can be very enduring and all-consuming. You two families, or maybe even three families, spend a lot of time together, barbecues in the backyard, maybe even go away on holiday together every year. And then the children separate. Perhaps they go to different high schools, or if they go off to university, they go to different universities. And those friendships just evaporate, literally evaporate overnight. And you bump into these people in the aisle in the supermarket several years later, and you say, oh, we haven't seen you for ages. How have you been? Oh, you must come around sometime. And, oh, yes, well, yes, definitely, we must get together. And you go away feeling warm and cozy, and of course, nothing happens.
Right.
And then 12 months later, you bump into each other in the aisle again, same aisle, same supermarket. Oh, you must come round. It's never going to happen. That friendship was a friendship of convenience.
Right.
Created, right. It was of the moment. It was very satisfactory for the purposes that it existed for, which of course, was the friendship of the kids primarily. You got some positive vibes out of it and all the rest of it. Some good
Yeah.
friends. That's not to say they're all like that before anyone starts sending you emails. But that seems to be such a common thing, and it characterizes our friendships in general, that often they're just circumstantial. They're who's available and who's free.
Right,
uh, you
right.
know
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a tough thing, because it's, friendship, as you say, is so much about who's convenient. Like,
yeah,
who are you near? Who is around you?
yeah,
Who's doing the things that you want to do? That's sort of
yeah,
like a solid basis for a friendship, is common interests and, yeah, being physically near one another.
yeah. I've
Um,
just if you are in a position where you want to make friends, then the best advice I have for you is join some kind of club, even if you're
mm.
a girl. That's a boys' environment, you might say, but no, no, no. If you're And if you're going to join any kind of club, I would join a singing club, a chorus, a choir. Not necessarily, not one to be doing Bach cantatas at sort of, performance level. I just mean a casual, round a campfire, old community songs, modern pop songs, whatever type of singing, because singing has an extraordinary effect. We called it the icebreaker effect. It seems to have this capacity to turn complete strangers into people who think they have known each other since kindergarten in just an hour of singing together. Absolutely magical. So any kind of activity, because it's just, a club is like an environment to meet people, or a church, whatever, that anything where people come, those are the places to go. And you'll find the one person who's also looking for a friend, if you like, much more easily there. But somehow there's something magical about singing that produces this kind of intimacy in a way which almost nothing else does.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm glad you said that, and I love singing, so I'm all for that. Thank you so much for talking with me today. Your book, of course, is called Friends: Understanding the Power of Our Most Important Relationships. I know you've written other books as well. Where can people find this one and find your other work?
I guess in any online bookshop, without mentioning any names near you. um, Certainly the Friends is now available in bookshops in America. I think it came out there in the spring.
Okay.
And yes, there are various other books that go back many decades, I think.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you again for your time.
Great pleasure. Lovely to talk to you.
Okay, take care.
Right.
Bye
Bye.
bye.